Okay.
Okay. Well, we didn't miss much. For the people listening to the recording, all we've done is introduce the presenters, Mike Galdi, Kent Grasso, and myself. Talked about putting the questions and possible problem properties in the chat. Talked about the 311 system. And next, we're going to go to receivership because that's sort of the linchpin of turning vacant properties around. And Kent's going to talk about that for a couple minutes.
Sure. So again, I'm the code enforcement attorney for the Northern District. There's at least one attorney for each of the 9 districts in the city, which I believe are based on the city planning district. So they map similarly to the police districts, but not exactly the same. Receivership is sort of the big stick of code enforcement because it has the most dramatic remedy if property with a vacant, well, as the summary outlines, you do have to have a vacant building notice to be eligible for receivership. But once there is that vacant building notice, and if a receivership is filed, the court can appoint a vacant building receiver. Here in Baltimore, we usually use for single family homes, or not for commercial properties, for residential, we use a nonprofit called One House at a Time. And they will attempt to auction off the property to someone who agrees to rehab the property, usually within about a year of settlement. So that is the big stick. It is not a speedy process, and there are a lot of other outcomes, a lot of which are positive, that can come out of receivership cases other than someone's property getting auctioned off. We do typically work with homeowners who own properties with vacants to rehab the properties if they do wish to do that. And there is, ultimately, if that doesn't happen, we will ask the court to appoint the receiver. And if the court does, then we are able to auction off the property. So that's the big one. The original CodeMap, I think, was covered a lot of the code enforcement issues, and as I'm sure Mike's going to talk about, the improvements sort of go way beyond the basics of code enforcement and do a lot of neat things. So that's 2 minutes on receivership. Briefly, again, the vacant building notice is going to be issued by the inspectors if the house is open to casual entry. If there's a giant hole in the roof that they can see. There is also, as of a few years ago, something called a nuisance vacant, which gives a little more flexibility to community associations, folks like Peter, to get vacant building notices where one might not normally be. A common misconception is that a vacant and unoccupied building is not necessarily a vacant building for the purposes of code enforcement. So just because no one's living there, it may not have a vacant building notice. But in situations where the property is unoccupied, if there are a series of regular citations for interior, exterior violations, or high grass and weeds or trash, there is sort of an alternate route to get a nuisance vacant building notice, which enables us to file receiverships just as any other vacant building notice. So that's receiverships in, I guess, 4 minutes.
Yes, and one of my pet peeves is that you can't normally get a vacant building notice from most inspectors for a situation where the door is chain shut or it had wooden steps and they're missing, things that obviously make the house unlivable. That's one of my things I fight with the city over, and sometimes I win, but usually not. But that's a pet peeve of mine. I believe I put the current stats for vacancy in that I actually looked up in CodeMap today in their search feature, and the city is down to 15,693 vacants, and it cleared 1,041 vacant properties with use permits last year. Other properties dropped out of vacancy because they were demolished. I don't know how many that was. It was several hundred, I'm sure. So moving on to the next big issue that people don't really think of as code enforcement, but really is a very important reason why we have so many blighted buildings in Baltimore and have to do so much code enforcement work. And that is that many people live in properties that they've inherited from a family member and haven't gone through probate, haven't gotten a new deed. And that's something that works okay for a while. You know, you can just live in the house. The neighbors all think you own it. It's all cool. But when you have to start working on the house, you find out that you can't get a loan against it. And you can't sell it to anybody because you don't have a deed to it. So, you know, 10, 15 years down the road, you find out you've got a property that you can't really do anything with, and a lot of people abandon them. Fortunately, there is some help. There always has been some help, but now there's more help. The Maryland Volunteer Lawyer Service and their program, which is a website, if you Google My Home, My Deed, My Legacy, they have a program where they help low-income, quote, homeowners or families of homeowners or someone who wants to set up an estate, find a lawyer, figure out a way to pay the fees, which I think they just got lowered last year, so that house can turn over and, you know, something good can happen. And it really, the houses that don't turn over is really a tremendous loss of community wealth and just, in a way, just a tragedy. So I would love for all these houses out there that are time bombs for possibly for future vacancy to get taken care of. So we'll see how well that works in coming years. The other issue is property registration and licensing. The city has had a rule where rental properties and empty properties needed to be registered, and that had been in existence for as long as I can remember, at least 10 years. I started getting failure to register citations 10, 15 years ago, so I know it existed then. I didn't really realize it was happening until I started getting the notices, and I probably there's still a few people out there that are getting notices and they don't know why. But anyway, like I said, rental properties and empty properties, non-owner occupied properties are supposed to be registered. If you're renting the property out, if you have a tenant, the property is supposed to be licensed. And the city actually did a study of trying to figure out how many properties are properly licensed and registered. And the number I remember them coming up with was that 85% of the properties are properly licensed and or registered. That sounds good. That is pretty good. But when I'm getting a complaint from a community resident, the property is usually not properly licensed or registered. There's something wrong. A lot of them were registered up until the time there was licensing, and then they stopped even registering it, probably because they thought they couldn't get a license. So the norm for me when I hear a complaint is the property, there's a problem with the licensing and registration. The stick there, and Kent probably may know more about this than I do, is that the owners don't have access to the courts to do an eviction or other lease enforcement until the property is properly licensed. But a lot of the landlords that have unlicensed properties really aren't all that scared of it. or they don't appear to be all that scared of it. So they're just rolling on down the road, like nothing has happened.
Peter, if I could chime in quickly, I mean, I think I would agree that that's true, and the advocates in the courthouses know to advise renters of those things when they go for help with respect to eviction processes. The other thing I would say that's helping that is, here we are in a Zoom meeting in the middle of the pandemic. The city programs that provided rental assistance, also sort of a requirement of that was that the property not only be registered, but properly licensed. And there were a whole bunch of properties that sort of came to attention through that process where they, I would say some of them actually honestly thought they were licensed and for various reasons weren't, but it's something that I think definitely is getting, that number is getting smaller over time as programs like this sort of shake that stuff out.
Yeah, that's true. But I've sent off a list of hundreds of properties in Kent's district that aren't properly licensed and registered, and the city really isn't doing much on the way along the lines of sending out citations. And I know the people that do that work are busy, and they've been working on the emergency rental assistance and so on. But I think we'd be better off if more properties were registered. The city would be in better shape. Tenants would be more protected. I think most everybody would be better off living in a licensed property. So we're actually like 2 minutes ahead of time, which is great. And I have asked Mike to go through the basic features of CodeMap, just to pull a property and pull up the what you can find in the pop-up and discuss that. And I picked a property in Charles Village, which has quite a bit in every pop-up that you choose. So, and that property is 2901 St. Paul Street. And Kent is very familiar with this property and probably pretty frustrated.
Hey everyone.
Okay, Mike, you want to talk about this, or maybe I should just respond to what you have on the screen, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I think you can go through it for sure.
Okay. As you can see, he's pulled up the pop-up. It's in Charles Village. We know that. It's owned by a Ralph LeBlanc, who's been dead for quite a while. He was a psychologist or psychiatrist, and if you look inside the window on the first floor, you see file cabinets full of old medical records that have never been moved for the last 15 years. So, and then down below that, you can see that it last changed hands in 2005, what it sold for at that point, and that its zoning is R8. In fact, this sale date and sale price often has information in it that's not in SDAT because it goes back further. I don't know where the city pulls that information from, but it's a different database. So that's often useful because you will actually see that someone bought a property in 1975 and you can't find that in SDAT. But if we moved on to notices, you'll see that it has interior and exterior notices. The building looks pretty rough on the outside. It has a board on one of the windows. Once we pull up the street view, but what it doesn't have is a vacant building notice because someone lives on the third floor, and it really appears that they live there. So as problematic as this building is, it will never get a vacant building notice as long as that's going on. So we can move on to the next pop-up, which is citations. And if you go down the list, you will see that it's got lots and lots and lots of citations for everything under the sun. And Mike, I asked Mike a question yesterday as to what appears on that list, if every citation ever appears or they disappear once they get paid. I'm sure none of these have ever gotten paid. Mike, were you ever able to figure that out?
I put a question into our IT department. I believe it goes back to 2016, but I'm not sure if they like go off if they're paid or if certain types only show up. But it looks like there's lots of different types.
Yeah, all the citation types do show up. I'm sure of that. As you can see, there must be 5 or 6 or 7 different kinds just for this one property. So we can move on to the next drop down, which is
Permits.
Permits. Yeah, I don't think there's any permits here. Well, there was one. Actually, they did replace some second floor windows last year, which is interesting because I don't think anyone lives on the second floor. So, so Kent knows, we all know that the inspectors know that someone's doing something with this house. I'm not sure that, well, Kent can maybe jump in, but we may not know who that person is that's kind of responsible. But it's just one of those frustrations. And one of the reasons that we don't know that information is because it's not licensed and registered. So, you know.
Yeah, I would add, you know, in situations like this, someone's clearly maintaining the property. So we have the ability with citations and notices to also include operators of property. So my educated guess here is that it's a relative. So we can include them in a civil suit. If it were a receivership, there are ways to take care of estate situations. Going back to what Peter was mentioning, it's slow, it's a laborious process, but it can be done. But with that's just for receiverships. With civil injunctions like what this would be, we can include an operator, but again, we have to be able to identify the operator and get them served and bring them into court and then see what happens from there.
Right. Like I said, this is about as complicated as it gets, right? So the next one is legal. And as you can see, Kent decided to pull the case for legal in 2019. But I think because he doesn't have anyone to take to court, he hasn't filed a case. This probably has nothing to do with COVID, right?
Well, it's a little delayed because of COVID. So the party to the case will be the operator, the believed to be operator. So this one will get into court, assuming no additional court closures in early 2021.
Okay, so yeah, we can always hope for the best, and we can move on to the next pop-up, which the next drop down, which is SStat. And here we can see that Mr. LeBlanc owned a building on Light Street, and I think his estate still does own that building on Light Street. He moved off to Michigan before he died, I'm pretty sure. So this isn't the only property in Baltimore that there's some mixed up ownership issues. And, you know, I think all of you have seen the SStat page, but importantly, it gives the current assessment. Up in the right, near the top right corner, it says whether it's a principal residence or not. And that's important because, well, slightly important because those are the ones when we get to CodeMap that show up in purple as owner occupied. But if you go to the bottom of the SStat page, all the way to the bottom, you will see a couple more comments, and the most important one is whether what's going on with the homestead application status. And this one has no application. A lot of places will be sitting in purple, having owner occupied being yes, but they've never applied for homestead. I've also seen the opposite, where people have applied for homestead and they don't show up in purple. And but really interestingly, you can find out a person has probably moved out of the property because their homestead application status is denied. So, and that's happens more often than you would think, at least with problem properties. So, and then as you can see a little further up, it gives you history of the sales history of the property. You can go back, it goes back 3 sales, but it doesn't go back past the late 80s, I think. So sometimes the last sale is not there. So we can go back to the drop downs and pull up the street view. And you can see this property in all its glory. If you get to the front, go around the corner and look at the front, you'll see one of the windows on the front has a board in it. But that's not enough to get it a vacant building notice. So let's see. So anyway, and it always brings up the side of the building when you go into Street View for some reason. I don't quite understand that. Additionally, that things that I rarely look up, it gives you access to the plat map, which is the city's, gives you the block and lot and all that stuff out of the city records. I rarely look at it. I doubt if the neighborhood people are going to be looking at it. It gives a neighborhood profile, which has interesting information from the census, mostly from the census, some information from the DHCD system. And of course, that's only as good as the census numbers are. And, census always says there's huge numbers of vacant properties, unoccupied rental properties in Charles Village. And I've never really understood that. But anyway, the number, it is as good as the census is good. With that is, those things are, to me, the key to really quickly looking up and trying to figure out what's going on with the property. And those things were in the old CodeMap, but the new CodeMap that Mike and his people have brought out has a lot more features. So since we are okay on time, I'm not looking at the questions. Mike, would you like to start talking about the new features of CodeMap while I read a few questions and try to figure out which ones I should answer?
Yeah, that sounds good. Let me start by just giving kind of a basic overview of how it works for people that aren't too familiar, and then we can get into the advanced tools. So yeah, like we were talking about earlier, the purple fill color means that it's an owner-occupied property, and you kind of make assumptions using the other layers. So you have the red square means vacant building notice, and a blue square means it used to be a vacant, but it got a use and occupancy permit, which we sometimes just call rehabs. So you can kind of see those buildings that don't have any of the colors on them. You kind of think, okay, well, that's probably a renter or a commercial building maybe, but most often it's a renter. Then you have green, which is city-owned, brown is housing authority, and then you have a lot of different layers that have to do with our department, such as receiverships are the yellow triangle. Those are some of the basics. Really, as Peter said, the bread and butter is you can type in a property and then you can real quickly get that pop up. But there's a lot of things you can do. I guess while we're zoomed in here, there's all these other layers you can turn on in the layer list over here. I won't get into them too much, but just very basically, you can expand something like this one, and you'll see, okay, there's only one of these land activity and transaction layer groups that start out turned on, and you can kind of explore them. Like, for example, you can see that there's this date and price layer that helps you actually visualize the sales prices and dates. So you can see this was sold in 2018 for 470,000, 2019 for 277,000, and so now that layer is on here. And there's plenty of those where like there's all these different things that you can turn on. Open work orders. You can see in the legend here that you can see clean work orders and how long they've been open for, boarding work orders. And so we won't get into all this, but definitely explore around that. And one of the new features, if you are in a new session one day and you open up CodeMap, there's this button in the bottom right that you can see and you can click on here. That will take you to not only where you were zoomed the last time you used CodeMap, but also it has all of those additional layers you turned on. And so that's kind of the power of visualizing at the neighborhood level, because when you get to a level like this, you can kind of scroll around the neighborhood you're interested in and turn things on and just see patterns across the neighborhood. You can see, look at all these rehabs over here on these blocks. Then there's lots of other tools, like if we go to the citywide or maybe multiple neighborhood level, you can see all of these different boundaries. These are our DHCD focus areas, which mean a lot to us, that you can see over here. And one of the new features is if you don't know what one of these means, for example, streamline CE area, under focus areas, you can click on the 3 dots and you can hit description, and that will tell you a little bit about it. So these are the streamlined code enforcement areas in the middle market. And yeah, and so while you're at this level, we also have this cool option to turn on a bunch of different boundaries over here on the bottom. And we have all these different boundaries. You can turn on neighborhoods, and you can even look at different political boundaries. Like you can look at Baltimore City Council districts, U.S. congressional districts. There are census boundaries. There are city boundaries, like school zones and zip codes. City program. Oh, okay, I talked about that. That's right. There's quite a few of those. And yeah, and you can look at the zoning, which is really nice. Looks a little bit crazy, and all kinds of stuff. So that's pretty powerful there. So for example, if you wanted a map of zoning for a neighborhood, what you could do is we'll turn off focus areas too to make it less crazy. You could zoom in, and you could use one of the new features. So let's say you want a zoning map of Upton. There's all these buttons on the bottom here that I wanted to talk about. So the one here with a printer on it, guess what that does? It prints. You can click on that, and it opens up this other window. All the windows you can kind of minimize, you can open, you can close, bring it back up. They're very, very intuitive. And you click the print one, and now you can just hit print, and it's just going to print your screen of what you're looking at on the map. So you don't really have to mess with it unless you want to change the title. You're free to do that. And it can take a little bit to create the print if you're on Wi-Fi. It takes usually a lot less if you're on a work computer or somewhere that's plugged in, but it can take like 30 seconds or so. So we're going to move on to the next tool while that's going. But before we get into the next tool, on the top here where you search for the address, there are some cool links you can see. You can see a gallery of other tools that our team has created, research and analytics tools. So if you want to look at like a dashboard of vacant, so a dashboard of vacant buildings and rehabs and demolitions, and sort by neighborhood and the market type, whether it's strong or middle or weak. Anyway, there's lots of tools up there. Then you have our DHCD website, the old version of CodeMap, and you can download real property to look at just like every property in the city and see all of this different information about each property. So you can do a lot of analysis on your own. And Peter, how am I doing on time? Did you want me to keep going through some of the advanced tools, or did you want to take back over?
Oh, let me do a few questions, and then we can go back to advanced tools if we're still okay on time.
Sounds good.
I've got a question about e-permits and how they show up in the drop-down box. And the answer is that they don't show up until a few days after you actually pay for the permit and finalize it. So any permitted process does not appear on CodeMap. And I remember years ago talking to inspectors, and they would tell me, "Hey, there's a I don't know, see what your problem is. There's a permit on the place." And I said, "Well, why can't I find it in CodeMap?" And that's because the permit was being in process, unpaid for, not finalized, down in the permit section. And of course, the inspectors are happy to see that a permit is in process, and that's okay. But to tell the community member that there is a permit when it's not finalized isn't exactly correct. There was a couple questions about commercial versus residential properties, and the answer is that all the same information is available for commercial versus residential properties. It's exactly the same information. There are differences in the code itself for commercial properties. In fact, the code is not quite as strict for commercial properties, and the receivership, especially for larger commercial properties, can be more difficult and expensive for the city to initiate. But as far as we're looking at those drop-down boxes and whatever you see on the screen, there really is no difference. You can find out exactly the same information. You got a question about how many properties are owned by city residents. It's hard to tell. I mean, when you look up for a problem property, very, very often the owner does say Baltimore. A lot of times those are in zip codes, 212 zip codes right outside the city. A lot of the times that is owned by a resident who's died. So I don't know if you're still a resident after you die, but I guess a former resident. And more properties are being bought by out-of-state investors since the banking crisis in 2008, and they're still here. I was just looking up one where the guy's buying up properties. I found his address in Florida, and then I pulled up his company, and it was like a listing of properties in Baltimore and Philadelphia, and Philadelphia on the website was started with F because the whole listing was in Spanish. But anyway, this guy is obviously buying properties in Baltimore and Philadelphia and speculatively selling them off to people, hopefully not unsuspecting, right behind the ears investors, I hope, but I wonder. Let's see. There was a question about the owners not getting notification that they're supposed to register. And I would say, yes, especially over the last couple of years when the city has stopped sending out as many registration notices, you would kind of have to be in the industry and know you have to register your property, or have an inspector tell you have to register your property, or get the violation to know you need to register the property. There's no like regular notification. If it was up to me, the city would be sending property owners a letter every year, and if they didn't respond, they would tell them they should register, and if they don't, they'll get a citation, and then giving them a citation. The city obviously either doesn't have the resources to do that, or doesn't want to, but that would be my preference, but that's clearly not what they do. How long does it take for a violation to appear in CodeMap? I think it's about a week after it's finalized. Sometimes they sit around, I don't know if it was on the inspection office, but I do know that sometimes they have to go through a level of review by the superintendent. So sometimes the 311 will say that a notice is being issued, and then it's not issued for a few more days, and then it takes a few more days to show up on CodeMap. But they do show up. And then this is interesting going back to Mike, because a person asked me how you can export data from, if you can export data from CodeMap. And of course, I think Mike's already mentioned some of the ways you can do that, or will mention some of the ways you can do that. So
Yeah.
we are still okay on time for Mike to go on maybe 5 more minutes.
Okay.
Does that sound good?
Yeah, I'll do 5 more minutes. Thank you. So real quick, to tie up our print feature, this is what it came up with. It opens up a new tab. The zoning looks kind of crazy on the legend, but it actually normally looks pretty cool. It just has the layers that you had turned on the legend. And then it has our logo and the title, whatever title. We just left it as this, and the date. And what you do is then you could hit this, either print to a printer or just download it to a file on your computer. And so that's the print feature, very easy to use. You just click a button. And one thing I want to show before the download is this button on the right, the About button. This is going to be important. So a lot of people that have questions, you can check this out. The latest features. I think I'm one update behind actually, but there is the link to the old CodeMap, and then here is the key stuff. So there's a user guide which has some general tips. You can email me up here, and it goes through how to use some of the advanced tools. So for example, the data tables tool, this is a really short and easy way to teach you how to do it if you forget. And there's also a recorded training. It's like a 45-minute thing. I think 15 minutes are questions maybe, but you can just skip to the part of the tool. So then I just wanted to get that in real quick. So the data table part is actually this middle button at the bottom. It's called Analyze. There's 2 different ways you can get the data from CodeMap. These are both ways to get data from CodeMap. One way is if you have a very specific way that you want it, and it's like a certain block or a shape or a circle or something. This actually lets you draw it. So I'll show you how that works. Let me close the legend. So the key to this one is, so let me just kind of go through. You can select by polygon. That's what it starts at. So let me just show you the default. You open it. We'll start over. You open it, and you just kind of make sure that the layer you want is checked and turned on in the layer list. So these ones that are already checked are the ones that are already turned on. But let's say we want receiverships too. But really, most people just want these properties here. And vacant building notices is a good one. So let's say we draw around a specific shape like this here. And we have our shape, and then we double click it. And it's going to select the properties here. So it selected 100 vacant building notices in that area and 329 properties. What you can do is then you can click on the 3 dots and you can download as a CSV. And then you should be able to see this on my screen. You can see the information. So these are all of the properties, and this is all the real property information. So we can see, is it a homeowner? Is it a vacant lot? Who owns it? The sale price, sale date, like all that great SDAT information, the year it was built, and all that. You could also do that for the 100 vacant building notices by clicking on those dots, and you can see that. Okay, so I think I have like 1 more minute left, so let me just real quick jump to the other one. Here are data tables. I clicked on that other one. I know I did that quick, but it's the other button in the bottom middle button. Once you click on that, and it pulls up this table. You can resize it. We'll make it about half the screen, and it has all of these different all the data tables we saw in the other tool. They're the exact same, and you can go through them by clicking on these tabs. And then to get over, you can see properties here is on the end. We can have vacant building notices. And what you can do is, right now, it's filtering by your viewable area. So it's only showing the 186 features, if you see this number down here, that are on this screen. And if I click this button, it will show every single vacant building notice in the city in this table. So once again, I'm on Wi-Fi, so it'll take like probably 5 more seconds. And it will show you that we have, there we go, we have 15,700 features. It looks like we got 1 more vacant building notice since Peter pulled his number. But yeah, so what you can do here, the last thing I'll show you, is you can click on this button, you can download that to a table file, or you can just kind of scroll through it here and see all the information. You have neighborhoods, council districts, housing market topology, and you're able to, bring it to Excel and do all kinds of cool stuff with that. So they all also have a column called block lot, so you can join them to each other and kind of do cool analysis like that. And so, yeah, so I think that was my 5 minutes, Peter.
Okay, that sounds good. I got a few more questions. And Kent maybe would want to answer this one. I got a question about the $900 citations. What does that mean? You want to try to handle that?
Yeah, I think it's a failure to abate citation for the vacant building notice. So we do have the ability to have the inspectors issue those citations in the hope that that will spur people into action and make a receivership case unnecessary. So that's definitely a preliminary option.
Okay, the next question is about reporting unregistered properties, which is one that I really wish I knew the answer to. I've sent them off to the city office that issues the violations, which is the special investigation section. I've sent them to the superintendent in the inspection districts. None of that really works. I just don't think many unregistered properties are getting citations these days. DHCD could argue with that, but we'll see. I really think that they're not sending out as many as they used to. Got a question about results from a permit inspection. There's really not that much in CodeMap. There is information for your own permits in the ePermits file for yourself that you log into, but you can't really see that information for someone else's permits. It also asks you about expired permits. Well, if you look up in the permit section and the date is past the end date, it's expired, and the little gray lines will disappear. So that you can find if the permits are expired. What you can't find out is if they're in process or where they're in process. And the last question I got.
Well, Peter, and I would add, Mike, you can jump in too. You can also see if there's open permits just by looking at the overview map. There's usually the lines, the horizontal lines.
Yes,
like
that's
that.
True. Yes.
Yep, that's great.
Yeah, sometimes I look to see how long they've been expired if the lines disappear. So, yes, but that's a good quick way to look. And if there are open permits, a lot of permits aren't really real because someone will get a permit for putting in 5 circuits and they'll just renew it. So, you can really do no work and keep your gray lines on the properties for years. Really want to do that. It makes your property look less suspicious. Not many people do that, but some people actually do that. So, it's a thing among people really in the know about how to disguise the fact they have an empty property they're not doing anything with. The last question I got, well, maybe there's more, but it was a really interesting one that I don't know the answer to, and that I've actually asked before. It asked me if the citations that show up in the drop down on CodeMap are the same as the city liens against the property. And I believe that they are not, that they only periodically get added onto the person's personal land account. And I actually bought a house through tax sale, and some of the citations showed up in the lien sheet, and then some of them that existed at the time of, that I bought the certificate popped in later, and they continue to pop in. And I just don't think it's 100%, it's not automatic. It doesn't show up against the property's account the day the city puts the citation on the property. And sometimes I suspect they never show up, but I just don't know how that works internally. But it's a good question. That is it for the questions. So I would like to go and start pulling some properties that people sent me. I can, Mike, would you like to continue to do the typing and clicking?
Whatever's easiest for you, Peter. What do you?
That probably is.
Okay.
Okay, the first property is 2466 Green Mountain Avenue. And if you pull up the street view on it, 2466. Well, it's property next door, but it's across the street.
Okay.
Oh, okay. So it's right. Yeah, it's right there. So now we're looking at the building. These buildings to the left are all demolished now. 2466 is still there, and you can see that even from the front that it has some problems with the windows. The person that reported to me says there's trash in the backyard. I wasn't able to find out if this building's occupied or not, but all I can say is, well, let's see if it has any notices against it. I don't think it does. Oh, it does have one. Let's see what that notice is for. Garage trash and debris. So it's got a notice for the for sanitation, but it does have some problems with the windows. So I'm going to have to go by there and see if I can get a violation against the property itself, against the structure. And it looks like since windows, I might be able to do that. At least Kent, and I'm not sure that every attorney does this the same way. Kent asked that there be a notice against the structure plus any other notice against the property. So in theory, this property, if it's empty, if we could get a notice on the windows, might someday qualify for nuisance vacancy. But maybe it's occupied and people are living under really bad conditions, and that's another problem altogether that we'll have to look into. So I think that's all we can do there, because really we have to go by and take a better look at it and figure out what's going on. The next two properties are kind of the same. They're 2817 and 2819 Windsor Avenue. And for 2817, if you look in, you look under legal, you'll see that they started a receivership case, but it never moved forward to a court date. And that wasn't probably because of COVID. The reason it didn't move forward is if you look up in the Maryland judiciary search and try to, if someone else doesn't put it in there, I'll put in the link for that. You can look up the property and see if it has an open foreclosure against it. And if you look up this property, you will see that it does have an open foreclosure, but the foreclosure is not going well, that they don't seem to be able to contact one of the owners and they can't move forward and This one may end up back in receivership someday because the foreclosure failed. The property next door has almost the same thing going on, 2419, except for that foreclosure seems to be moving quickly, and that one looks like it will actually get foreclosed on and change hands. So like I said, 2817, you know, if you're in the community, and this happens, it used to happen more. The code enforcement attorney would tell you, hey, that's under foreclosure. And they say, well, that's cool. And then it never changes hands. And then you find out that for some technical reason or something, that foreclosure never went through, and it really needs to end up going back to receivership. And that really does happen. So would you agree, Kent?
Yeah, it's tricky because they you know, the process is slow. Foreclosures really create a lot of difficulties for the receivership process, whether it's a mortgage foreclosure or a tax sale foreclosure. And then if we're talking about tax sale foreclosures, it depends on whether it's an open case or if they've already gotten the judgment and just not recorded the deed. All of those things are a little different, but none of them are good. And they're not so much a legal problem in the sense that we can't get a receiver appointed. There's sort of two pieces to making receivership work. There's the court process and the legal requirements, and then there's the back end, which is actually transferring these properties and getting title insurance on them. That is a lot more complicated in some respects. So whereas, you know, there are ways for me to get receivers appointed where there are open foreclosures, oftentimes the trouble comes on the back end. So you do sometimes have to keep an eye on them and see what happens and try to make, you know, the most strategic decision accordingly. But it is definitely going to slow you down any way you cut it.
Yeah, so, you know, I think one of these days, these properties will be resolved. You know, if you're the neighbor living on the other side of the wall, I'm sure it's frustrating. No one likes living next to a totally abandoned house where the owner's flown the coop or whatever. But you know, the city's, you know, something is being done with them. So at least we have that.
Yeah, and I would just add, I mean, myself and my colleagues, we're as far as city government goes, very accessible. So, you know, I mean, oftentimes the thing to do if you're wondering about a specific property is just to call and or email and ask us. We do respond to our phones and emails. So, you know, oftentimes, I mean, this system is pretty remarkable that Mike and company have built. But I mean, a lot of times, especially with the legal stuff, it's just hard to convey in this form. So a lot of times just, you know, having a conversation where I can look it up and figure it out is the best thing to do. Peter, I note I'm looking at 2817 Windsor. We actually, that one got sold at auction in October. The settlement is pending. So that's an example of something that you can't necessarily see, but that work is, you know, coming.
Okay. Well, that sounds good. The next one to look at is 2117 Homewood Avenue in Midway, or East Baltimore Midway. Okay, if we look at legal here, it's been in receivership. And it was returned to the field office. And just because I'm working in that neighborhood and asked the city what's going on with this block, they decided that they'd had too many failed receiverships and the values weren't there and the block is not ready for receivership. And they kind of asked me to hold my horses and wait, and which means the neighbors have to wait. It's a really cool block. The houses could be on Calvert Street in the center of Charles Village and be worth $350,000, but these houses are not worth very much right now, and the city has decided not to move forward with this block right now. And I love that block, and I think I'm going to keep pressuring the city. I'm sure the community will keep pressuring the city, but that was their decision as of like 6 months ago about that block. And then someone asked me about properties around the corner, which are 720, 722, and 726 East 21st Street. And that area, the houses look kind of okay, kind of nice houses originally, but most of them don't have any roofs on them. I think 2720 has a partial roof. Yeah, you can see sky in that one. If you're there on the street, you will see that most of them you can see sky. The city, it's kind of like the ones around the corner, decided that these properties are in such bad shape that they weren't going to put them in receivership right away because they just don't think they can find a buyer, or that maybe they'll need to stabilize them before they can find a buyer. So that kind of answers what's going on with them. I think these houses will survive and get rehab someday, and I'd like to see them stabilized sooner rather than later, so that they don't, bother the neighbors. Because this is a classic case of where one house gets abandoned and the roof caves in, and then it sort of cascades down the block in both directions towards the other houses. Because if you've got an attached row house and water's getting in, then the water runs across the floor of that house and then runs through your wall, starts dripping down the wall of your house. All of a sudden your house becomes, borderline unlivable, and your house gets abandoned, and then it keeps moving. And, this is about as bad as it gets. It's just, it's got to stop somewhere or the whole block disappears. Next one is 506 East 21st Street. I'm not sure what's going on with that one. It's just the next block over to the left. But if we look at legal there, it looks like it had a court date that got postponed and never got rescheduled, or hasn't been rescheduled yet. And fortunately for 506, there's no question that this house has value and would sell at auction for a decent amount of money. So, we'll have to get back to the attorney and find out why it hasn't been rescheduled.
Yeah, I would just add generally, courts were shut down from mid-March till the end of August, so that was clearly in that. We were allowed to start filing in late August, and so, but on a very limited docket sizes. So basically between September and December, maybe even into January, the attorneys are getting all their cases back into court, the ones that missed hearings during the pandemic. So I can't say that specific one that's just over the border into the eastern, but I have cases that are coming in between now and early January that are in similar situations.
Right. Yeah, I think this one will end up getting taken care of. It's a good house, good desirable house, and there's no reason that this house won't be rehabbed in a couple of years if we have any luck at all. The next one is 2523 Madison Avenue. Yeah, and this house, is that the right house?
Yeah, that's the one, Peter.
That's the one? Okay, well, I looked up the wrong one. So let's see what kind of notices it has, because has nothing, and it really doesn't have much going on. So no recent permits. So do you know if the house is occupied?
I'm not sure. I flagged it because it's kind of falling down in back, like you can see where like it's sort of leaning almost into the alley actually on the side, and in the back it's like it's very unstable, like the windows are being all compressed, and I figure I'm surprised it doesn't have that, no one's called in a violation on it.
Right. I think that a violation needs to get called in, obviously, and that, I like to find out as best I know whether the property, well, it has no windows in front in this picture. Does it have windows now?
No, that's not it, Peter. It's on the other side of the street.
Okay.
The gray, the other side of the alley. You had there, that.
Okay. So yeah, so we just got to call it in, but I think it would be best to know whether it is occupied, because I do like to say that the house is occupied or not when I do the 311, and I like to do it on the desktop system and take a picture. And this could be the case, depending on how bad the back is, where there is no safe egress, and where I think the city should be giving properties where you just can't get out the doors, either the front or the back door, vacant building notices automatically, but that's not what they do. But nonetheless, it's bad enough if the property is empty to probably pretty easily get a nuisance vacancy eventually. I think this is the property I did look up, and it is licensed, believe it or not, as bad a shape as it's in. So, and I've seen other properties, in fact, one that's been empty for 10 years and has a missing window that got a license. So I don't know what these licensing guys are doing, but that property on St. Paul Street that I'm after, shouldn't have got a license, and maybe this one shouldn't have either. So we can move on to 5013 Midwood Avenue.
Peter, my sound cut out. Could you repeat that? Sorry.
5013 Midwood.
It keeps cutting out the last word. I'm sorry on the ad.
Midwood. And if you bring up the street view, it's on the right. That's it. There it is. The White House with the overgrown yard and the really scary looking tree. That the neighbors complained to me about. This house is a disaster, and I haven't been able to get a vacancy violation against it, even though it's been empty for many years. And it's got this terrible overgrown yard, and the back deck has collapsed. But this is kind of like that house on St. Paul Street where, everything confounds the city as for getting things done, because you can't see the collapsed deck without going on the neighbor's property, where the inspectors aren't supposed to do. The front of the house looks basically okay, so it can only get sanitation violations. And Ken has told me like 3 times that this house doesn't meet the requirements for a nuisance vacancy. But this is just one of those things where circumstances conspire to keep an obviously vacant, problematic house out of vacancy and just sitting there. One of these days, something will fall off the front. and I'll be able to report it that something's wrong with the structure. But until then, I don't know. I don't know how long this will last. But it's a mess. And the final one that I have is 1703 Guilford Avenue. So this house has been declared vacant twice, and the owner has made some minor repairs. But the owner, if you look him up in the SDAT, he's recorded as living in Los Angeles. So, if he really lives in Los Angeles, he's not fixing the house. But somehow minor repairs have gotten made, and the house has gotten out of receivership twice. But if you look at citations, it does, I think, according to Kent, and Kent can tell me what the count is, but I think this property might be one of the few that's got enough citations, especially if you add the one I called in today or sent in today, to get nuisance vacancy just based upon citations.
Yeah, I think it's 6 citations within 1 year.
So we've had exactly 6 since November 25th. So if I can get another one this month, it would still be at 6. And so I'm going to ask the attorney there for nuisance vacancy and see how that goes. But I'm optimistic that maybe this third time will be the charm, because this will be the third time this property's been at a vacant building notice. So does anyone else have any other addresses they want to chime in with, or 714? We got a couple more minutes, or we could just let's see, look at 342 East Federal Street. Which is right near there. Oh, 342 East Federal Street. If you look this up in Maryland Judiciary Search, you will see that the judgment of foreclosure was granted in the last couple of months. That this is a very recent finalized foreclosure, and because this is a fairly valuable property, I'm expecting the tax sale certificate holder to settle and move on a rehab pretty quickly with this house. So, and let's see, 416 West Franklin Street.
Peter, while you're doing that, there's a question on the benefits of a nuisance vacancy. The nuisance vacancy is an alternate route to a vacant building notice, where it might not have an open door or be boarded or a hole in the roof, but you can still get, if it's causing a nuisance in the neighborhood, you can still get a vacant building notice. The key part, which often causes problems, is the inspectors have to deem it unoccupied. So it has to have X number of violations and be deemed unoccupied.
Right. 416. I'm not sure we have exactly the right address, or maybe we do.
It's 414 has a span address to 416.
Okay. This, I think this is an okay building. I think the problem property on that block is 420. So maybe the that property is definitely, that 420 is definitely a problem property. It's had a vacant building notice for years. There's rear collapse to the building. And Yusang Chung has a whole series of problem properties virtually everywhere. Virtually every property Mr. Chung owns has a vacant building notice and is in bad shape. So the attorney for that section, who is Greg Fox, has agreed to take that property and put it in the commercial section of the receivership auction. Maybe Kent can say a couple words about how that's different from the normal process.
Sure. We use a different receiver. So One House at a Time, which is our main receiver, they focus on residential properties and aren't really equipped to do the commercial properties, which are a little more complicated. So we use a group called the Casey Group as a receiver in those scenarios. And I mean, the main difference is just, they sort of have their own requirements, the Casey Group does, with respect to minimum bids, whereas to sell it at a One House at a Time auction, it has to go for at least $5,000. The dollar amounts can vary widely on the commercial properties, and sometimes the minimums can pose an impediment.
Yeah, I think despite the fact that this property is in really bad shape, McCormick Paint Building, a couple doors down, they're trying to get a decent amount of money for. I think this property will sell, maybe not for a fortune, but I think this will be successful eventually when it gets there. I've got a question about 3103 and 3105 Independence. Oh, there we go. So, this is interesting. Can you pull up the street view, please? Oh, 3103. I have noticed that property, and I can't. This is one that I would have been better for me to look up in advance. 30, as you can see, 3103 has permits. I believe that when I went by last, not much had happened with those permits, but I don't know. I just really can't say right now what's going on there. And let's try.
Peter, I can just add, it looks like they just opened a permit about not even a week ago for interior and exterior alterations.
Right. Yeah, so I guess it's going to get worked on. 3105, I never even noticed a problem with 3105, and because I guess I always get hung up at looking at 3103, so I'm not sure what the issue with that one is. The last one, I think this should be the last one because they're slowing down a little bit. 2200 Erdman Avenue. Andrea, are you still on? Andrea? Okay, well,
yes, I'm on.
Can you tell us what's wrong with the property before we start looking at the drop downs?
I've seen open windows, It looks unoccupied. Number of cars with expired plates,
Oh,
that kind of general stuff.
okay. And which one are we? I don't see a red dot here.
It's the corner of Erdman and Harford Road. There's
Oh.
also a small carriage house, maybe garage.
Okay.
Haven Inn.
Okay, so can you click on that and see if we can see if there's a notice of any kind?
It still said it's owner occupied. I assume maybe it could be an estate. It's one of the ones that reflect on SBAT as like somebody and wife. Usually they're pretty old.
Yeah, purchased in 1797. Yeah, which obviously is not.
Are those just a typo, 1797?
I think that's the year that the city of Baltimore got its charter. So for a while there, they were putting everything that they didn't know what the date was as 1797. But that's just my speculation. You know, this is one that can you check and see if there's a citation against it at all? No, nothing. So this just plain needs to, let's see what it looks like in the street view, I guess. Is that it? Wow. Well, I think what needs to happen is if we can see it now as the leaves are off the trees, we're going to have to, someone's going to have to report it, because one thing you can tell from CodeMap is it doesn't have any citations or notices. So whatever's wrong with the property, the city doesn't know about it yet. So I think that kind of, think that kind of wraps it up. I hope people enjoyed the workshop here and learned something. And I really appreciate Kent, and I really appreciate Mike doing the typing and pointing for me so that I could keep talking, because it would have been much slower and not as good an experience for the guest if he hadn't been moving. Because to be perfectly honest, I'm a really bad typist, and I'd be typing in the wrong numbers all over the place. So Kent knows that, because I occasionally send him lists with the wrong addresses on. Anyway, I really appreciate it, and this will be recorded, and I will send the link to the recording out to the list that I know about, which won't go to everyone that eventually got it, but hopefully maybe some people will keep going back to this, and we will. I don't know. This may be better and got more people than we could ever do in our Neighborhood Institute workshops. So anyway, thanks so much, and I'm sure I'll be seeing most of you later, because I know who most of you are. Thank you so much.